I'm Paul Quinn. I'm the director of the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fictions, and it's quite a hot day here, so I think we'll push on. It's quite interesting doing it on the screen. Thank you for your patience. Those of you who are planning to attend in person, we had to rejig things, and having been teaching the machine stops for a couple of years on modernism, it's quite interesting back into this format where we're all looking at the screen. If you know that novella by Forster, you'll know that they talk about lectures and having ideas. Of course, they have no ideas whatsoever, so I think we'll be doing much better than them. We will actually have some good ideas in the room. We've got an interest from Paul Grave in a collection of essays for the papers that we're giving here today. So I will contact people after the event if anyone is interested in playing a part in that planned collection of essays, or if you know anyone else who might be interested, and we'll put out a general call for papers there, I think. As Heather said, if we can turn the mics off during the papers, leave the cameras on so that we know that people are still there. And then, you know, if anything terrible happens, like a robot revolution, we'll see when people are being attacked and we know that we can do something. I'm delighted then to introduce our first speaker, Professor Simeon Keates, who's the Deputy VC here at the University of Chichester, who has got responsibility for all aspects of the tech park on our Bognor Regis campus. Simeon is well travelled, Cambridge, Scotland, America, down to us then at Bognor. With a wide range of interests, including AI, human-computer interaction, and robots, which led him to competing in Robot Wars, the popular and resurrected television program in this country, which is why he's here today to talk to us to open this conference to mark one of the centenaries of R.U.R, where we can all consider robots and their ongoing place in culture, literature, politics, and society. So I'll hand over to Simeon. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. One of the unfortunate things about warm weather is there's also quite a surge in pollen, so my apologies if I sneeze at some point, and I'll try and mute before I do. Thank you for that, Paul. Delighted to be here. Yeah, as Paul suggested, I've got quite an interesting background on the grounds that I started off in my Cambridge days at in the speech vision robotics group dealing with rehabilitation robotics, and then moved from there onto more engineering design principles before starting to see how this interacts with artificial intelligence and where we can actually take the robots. So what I'd like to do though is I'll start off by showing the presentation. So if I click on, let me get that one. Sorry, did I? Hopefully you can see a slide that says the Robot 100 robot as partners. Can everybody see that? Good. Okay, put that into. Right, and hopefully now you should be able to see that at the proper size. Is that correct? Paul, you're the only person I can see. Can you see that properly?
It's working.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. Out of interest, can you also see my cursor? Can anybody see my cursor on the screen? I guess not. Okay, that's fine. All right. All right, so although I come at this from the background as an engineer and computer scientist, obviously, as with everybody else, I am well aware of the relation to popular culture and things like that and public consciousness. So I've got a quote on the screen I suspect many of you will recognize. It can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with, and sorry. It absolutely will not stop ever until you are dead. You're probably aware of the film that came from. Sorry, I hate you were about to get me. A slightly different approach. Emotions have tormented you all of your life. Now you'll be set free, and this is your liberation. Excuse me. These are the Cybermen from Doctor Who. Now, you might argue as to whether or not cyborgs classify as robots or not. In the first case, it was a cybernetic organism where the robot was inside the body. In the Cyberman case, the body is inside the robot. But the point is they show a kind of dystopian approach to robots, that robots are bad and dangerous and will try to take over and remove humanity. However, that hasn't always been the view. So obviously Isaac Asimov came along with his infamous 3 laws of robotics that are all about the sanctity of human life and the notion that robots are servants and they work with people to deliver a better future. So hence the 3 laws were initially proposed: may not injure a human being, must obey orders, must protect its own existence as long as it doesn't conflict with first or second law. And then ultimately, because those 3 laws were considered inadequate, a 4th law, but positioned as the 0th law: a robot may not harm humanity or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. Now, those of you who've read the R.U.R novels will know that there is one where robots were actually programmed to stop rushing into an area which is high in radiation to retrieve people who were working there, because the robots thought by them entering the area of high radiation, they're putting themselves in harm. So they were stopping the robots from doing what they needed to do. They were stopping the humans from delivering what they needed to do. And that removal of that protection bit caused further complications and allowed a robot to potentially become dangerous. So the laws have been explored at length in fiction. Apologies. However, robots haven't always been seen in fiction, as we know, as the bad guys. Depending how much you are into your science fiction, you might recognize this particular quote: "Wait, wait, oh my, what have you done? I'm backwards, you flea button furball. Only an overgrown mophead like you would be stupid enough." And it's a scene from The Empire Strikes Back when C-3PO was obviously being disassembled and reassembled in the incorrect order. C-3PO was very much a protocol droid, was there as human assistance and the ability to support interpersonal communication. So C-3PO wasn't there to conquer or take over. He was there to work and serve and help people get on with other people. It was really, really handy. Another example in science fiction: here I am with the brain the size of a planet, and they asked me to pick up a piece of paper. Call that job satisfaction? I don't. Now, depending how old you are, most of you hopefully recognize the quote from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There were 2 versions of this robot. It'll show your age as to which one of these 2 you associate that quote with. The one on the left being from the BBC TV series in the early 80s, and the one on the right from the film about 20 years ago. The film famously voiced by Alan Rickman. Now, obviously, the robot has been shaped very much through science fiction and its appearance in there, but that's not the only aspect to how people respond to it. So I just want to show you a quick newscast. This was from the university I worked at before joining Chichester, in relation to a new development we had in place there. So hopefully this will work. Might take a little while for the video to load. So.
Engineering tips. It's the University of Greenwich in Chatham has taken delivery of Robo-Thespian, which is billed as the world's first commercial android.
Yeah, it only costs about £60,000, but it'll actually be used to help teach students. One day, similar machines could become home helps or even help and care for the sick and elderly, as our business correspondent Mark Norman reports.
Hi. Welcome to the University of Greenwich and our beautiful Midway campus. My name is Robo-Thespian, and I am working with students to explore the future of technology.
He, and let's call him a he, is a computer in human form, I suppose, the stuff of science fiction, and more recently, the factory floor. But the university believe it can be so much more to all of us.
But now we have a chance, because the technology has advanced, to actually start thinking about what were those early ideas. Can we start using robots in the home? Can they help improve your quality of life? But it's also a chance to do more than that. This is a chance not just to look at those household chores, but to actually move forward and start thinking about, well, how could something like this actually enrich and improve your life?
For example, I can be programmed to monitor health devices and alert emergency services.
All a far cry from Abel Mabel, who made an appearance on Tomorrow's World in 1966. Honda have been working on Asimov, a humanoid robot, since the 1980s. The University of Medway teach advanced engineering and robotics and aim to...
So, don't need to show you all of that, but it just gives you an idea that the kind of robots that are available and that could become present in everybody's home. But what's very interesting, that robot, you'll have heard the whooshing in the background. That was because its movement was controlled by an air compressor. So you needed to have quite a powerful air compressor pumping air around to get enough strength for the robot to actually lift its arms and move around like that. But the compressor itself was incredibly noisy. So what we had to do was house the compressor in a different room and run a high pressure air cable through the wall to power the robot without the sound of the compressor kicking in. But what we did though was we often had that robot available for open days and events where the public were coming in. What was very interesting was the response to the robot. So a lot of people found the robot really quite cute and quite affecting. So it had, you'll have seen there was a little black dot in the middle of its forehead. That was a thermal imaging camera. It had a Microsoft Kinect control bar in its chest, so it could form an estimation of the body pose of the people it was looking at. So it could mimic your movements if it wanted to. So you could put it into mimic mode, and if you moved your arm in a particular way, it would try to copy that movement. Now, some people found this amusing and cute and quaint. Other people found it incredibly disturbing. They really didn't respond to it. You start to get close to the uncanny valley effect, which is the bit where, as technology gets more and more realistic, the closer it gets to resembling what you think it should be, sometimes the freakier it gets, because you're aware that something's not quite right and you can't quite put your finger on it. So the public response to that robot, children especially, some of them were hugging the robot and thinking, wow, how wonderful. Others were hiding behind their parents thinking, what is that strange thing? So it was very interesting to see the response to that, and especially as we start talking about, well, what would robots be like if we put them into people's homes? And we did some research onto this, and we found that, you know, things that influence how people respond to robots, their age, their gender, their previous experiences working with robots. So engineers, by and large, were typically incredibly comfortable with them. People from backgrounds where they weren't so used to having technology around, far less so. You also tend to find, obviously, some people are naturally technophiles, some are naturally technophobes. What was also very interesting, and there has been quite a lot of research on this, people's health status will impact how willing they are to have technology come into their lives. So people who are generally fit and healthy will take technology into their lives where they see benefit of it and where they're comfortable with it because the technology isn't a threat. At the other end of the spectrum, people who are very ill will accept all kinds of technology because they're worried about their own health status and they believe that the technology will help improve their health status. So you start looking then at, well, I don't mind being monitored if it means that the ambulance gets here more quickly. Things like that. So there were a lot of factors that we found as we were looking into this as to what makes people very responsive to robots. And yes, it also matters what films they've seen and what books they've read. As to where they view the technology, whether the technology is, you know, offering a golden age or whether it's something to be afraid of. Now, in terms of healthcare, you know, most of us are aware that, especially in the developed world, the aging population is here and here to stay. So the proportion of people over the age of 70 is the only sector of most developed countries' populations which is growing, and growing quite rapidly. The only thing that changes this is if there's large-scale immigration. But if you take that out of the picture, you know, so-called indigenous populations are aging quite rapidly. And in a lot of countries, the social care bill is becoming really quite an issue. How do you look after people as they get older? So there's a lot of investment and a lot of development work in that space of how do you keep people living in their homes for as long as possible. So the whole future of robotics, you know, where does robotics fit into the world in general? What roles do we want robots to do? And above all, from the research I've been looking at, how do we support those who need assistance? So So generally what you can do when you think about where do you want robots to sit, you take a look at areas of life endeavour. This was an area that I worked on back in my IBM days. So you can break down those so-called activities of daily living. You can start breaking those down into different aspects. So you take a look at things like access to education. You take a look at access to the workplace. You take a look at how can robots help you out and about in the real world, and feeding yourself and clothing yourself and all those kind of interesting things. Robots also play a role in entertainment and in socializing. So what I want to do now is take a look at a few examples of the robots in those places. So let's start off in the home. Robots are increasingly appearing, but most people, if you ask, what do you want a robot to do? It's the washing, and it's the ironing, and it's the putting clothes away. It's those kind of tasks that everybody finds boring and tedious. Surely a robot ought to be good at that, because robots are great at repetitive tasks. So this is actually where we're beginning to see some of the robots beginning to appear. So in this case, this is the Roomba, the robot vacuum cleaner, which is the little black disc off to the left-hand side here on the floor. So you can set one of these loose in your home. Ideally not when you've got a pet around, because it does tend to freak pets out. They don't know what to make of it. But these things will just go around and vacuum your floor, and once they're full, they'll go to a docking station, wait for you to come along and empty them, and then they'll start going again. But they still need some manual intervention to empty the dust out of them before they can go. They're also infamous for falling downstairs, because they're not terribly bright and they can't recognize where the top of stairs are, and of course they don't cope terribly well with such a tumble. Another area you'll find a robot in the home is obviously the lawnmower, but again you'll sometimes find robot lawnmowers halfway down the street because they've forgotten to recognize the edge of the garden, and they've probably gone and mown through whatever was on their way, or whatever was in their way on the way down the street. Now, given these things are quite expensive, having them wander off down the street and potentially get lost is something of an issue, and none of the robot manufacturers have really managed to get around this comprehensively. We can also use robots to support socialization. So again, some of you might recognize this robot. This was a project I worked on up in Scotland. So this is an old K9 shell from Doctor Who. What we did though was we stripped out the insides and put inside it an access to a chatbot. So the idea was that you could start talking to the robot dog as if it was a companion and start having a conversation with it. And again, part of that was to find out how would people respond to being able to work with something that looked like a dog but was able to talk, but was relatively familiar and known to be one of the good guys, if you like, from the television program. Again, this was one of those more interesting demos. The robot itself couldn't speak. What it was it had inside an internet relay connection to a base station, if you like, which handled all the natural language processing and fed back the answers. What we're interested in is how would people respond to such a chatbot in such a form. A lot of research around in assistive robotics has been around the notion of developing robot guide dogs. So rather than having to train an adorable little Labrador puppy or something like that to help somebody walk around unaided, could we develop a robot to do so? Not one of those has actually worked, because guiding somebody around a busy city or an interesting new environment, robots are notoriously bad at, whereas the dogs are incredibly adaptable and very much superior. So now if we take a look at robots at work, obviously we're all aware with robots that actually make things like cars and so on, and it's revolutionized the car industry. But what about trying to help people gain access to work, or again, trying to automate fairly tedious activities? Well, back in the 1990s, the EU invested in something called the TIDE project, which is telematics for the integration of disabled and elderly people. Language that would not be permitted now, but it's what makes up the acronym, so hence why it's repeated here. And the EU invested approximately £100 million in this space, so getting on for $120, $130 million. And it was focused on three main groups. Older people who don't think that they've got a disability, older people who do think they've got a disability, and younger people with a disability. Disability these days would use the words functional impairment, because the disability is a consequence of the impairment, not a condition in and of itself. So again, the language has changed somewhat since the days of Tide. So there are a number of projects that were funded through Tide. They're the European ones, and there are a couple that were going on at the same time in America. So here's a bunch of the robots that were being developed. So in the US, there was a robot called R.U.R, which has been developed by Boeing as what they called a vocational workstation. I'll show you a photograph of this in a minute, but a vocational workstation was basically something that somebody in a wheelchair would wheel up to and be able to get the robot to do all the manual bits of the job. In the Netherlands, there was Manus, which is a wheelchair-mounted robot. In Britain, the project I worked on was the EpiRaid project, which was a follow-on to the RAID project. Handy One wasn't funded by Tide. That was a commercial project, and I'll explain the difference in a minute. The Papworth Arm was also wheelchair mounted and funded by Tide. And now there's another one from the US Department of Employment, the Arlen Arm Workstation. So to show you what these look like, this was R.U.R, which is the desktop vocational assistant robot. So what you can see here is there's an arm coming down from the ceiling of the office, a robot arm. There's a computer in front of you. It looks like an old Apple Mac 2E or something like that. And there's a robot gripper, and in the robot gripper, that thin slither of black plastic that you can see is a good old 5¼ inch floppy disk, for those of you who remember such things. And obviously the robot is aiming to insert the floppy disk into the computer. The Manus, this is the one from the Netherlands, took a different approach, in that here you have a standard electric wheelchair, but what you've got is a little grey arm coming off from just by the user's knee, leading to a blue vertical column and then the white robot arm at the top end of it. So the idea being here that somebody in a wheelchair could have this wheelchair mounted robot, and if they themselves, if they had something like cerebral palsy, couldn't reach for something, the robot arm could do it for them. This is a great idea in that the robot's always with you, as compared to the vocational workstation approach where you go to the robot comes with you. The downside, of course, is that robot does not have a negligible width. So what it does is it actually makes your wheelchair quite wide. And it means that getting through doors suddenly becomes that much more of a challenge, because your robot has suddenly gained about 12 inches on the side of it. So the doors now have to be that bit wider to accommodate it. It also means that it runs off the power supply of the wheelchair. So range anxiety is not a modern invention of electric cars. It was also an aspect that wheelchair users had to consider. If they were powering their robot arm off their wheelchair battery didn't go as far. Now, this is the project I helped work on. So this is EpiRaid, a vocational workstation. So what we've got here on the left-hand side of the screen is the computer, desktop computer rather. Just in front of the desktop computer, there's a little metal bracket which had something called a page turner on it. So there's a robot gripper just above the metal bracket, which is on the blue metal robot arm that's you can see in the middle of the screen heading up towards the ceiling. And so what the robot gripper did, in this case, it had a very thin blade on it that you could slice into the book, and effectively you had to slice it so it would just pick over the next page and turn the page over for you. On the metal shelving, you'll see a whole bunch of files in plastic folders. They had to be in those plastic folders for the robot gripper to be able to grab them and move them around. And you'll also possibly see on the floor what we ought to have copyrighted is the original wastebasket item that you now find everywhere on things like Windows and Apple Mac. We could have made a fortune if we'd copyrighted that, but never mind. But there is a good old-fashioned waste paper bin on the floor. Now, this was the one commercial robot that was developed at the time, the Handy One. And this was designed for helping people to feed themselves. So in this case, this is one where the robot is positioned in the room. Somebody in a wheelchair approaches the robot. there's a little joystick off to the side of the main feeding tray. So the feeding tray is the big bit of brown plastic to the right-hand side here, just underneath the robot gripper. And just below that, you'll see there's a little black dot. That's the end of the joystick by which somebody would come up to this in their wheelchair. It's a telescopic base, so you can adjust the height of the robot up and down. And you could grab hold of the joystick. And then what it did was the little bit of plastic sticking out of the end of the robot gripper is a tiny little spoon. And the plastic tray that's beneath that gripper is divided into 5 sections. And what could happen is that a carer would come along, cook somebody a breakfast, say, and they'd put baked beans in one slice, they'd put chopped up sausages in another slice, they'd put a bit of bread in the third sector, and so on, and mushrooms in the fourth, and the like. And what could happen then is the person in the wheelchair could come along and control the little spoon, and could position the spoon above one of these slots and pick up some food and then bring it to their mouths and feed themselves. A very, very basic function, but the freedom it gave the people in the wheelchair, because it's the first time they'd ever been able to feed themselves. Up until that point, every single meal had been somebody else choosing what food was going to go into the spoon and putting the spoon in their mouths, and the quantity was determined by somebody else. So this robot actually gave people a chance to feed themselves for the first time ever. And although it might seem like a very basic function to most people, this was revolutionary for a lot of them. The users were absolutely delighted with this. And there was a follow-up version to this, which the food tray was replaced with a makeup tray. And so people could actually put their own makeup on themselves as well if they wished. So when we go back to the systems that were being presented, if we then start overlaying the prices, now bearing in mind, these prices are from 25 years ago. The R.U.R robot cost around 100,000. The Manus was about 35,000. The EpiRaid system, by the time you put all the features in, was $250,000. The Handy One was only 6,000, and the PAP with arm, similarly wheelchair-mounted robot to the Manus, was 8,000. So if you take a look at those prices and you think, these are intended to help people who are, some of society's most dispossessed, if you like, very limited resources, and you take a look at those prices, it raises an obvious question, which one of these robots do you think was a success? And you see those kind of prices that are attached to it. And so if we take a look at the number of robots sold, you'll see that the only one that sold in any kind of quantity was the Handy One robot, which was the only single purpose robot. It would feed you, but it was also the cheapest robot. And it was the one that had come from a company which was passionate about developing robot assistance. Most of the others were teams that had been put together because, isn't this an area of interest? And they hadn't really understood what it was that the users really wanted and were trying to get to. So if we take a look at EpiRaid, which is the one that I worked on at the tail end of it, the challenge that we had was there's no natural market to sell it to. It was far too expensive. And above all, it took so long to develop, it got overtaken by new technology. All the need to move bits of paper around or to put CDs or floppy disks into computers got obviated by the fact that the internet came along and everything was virtual in any case. So you didn't need a big expensive robot. What you needed was access to the computer. And there absolutely wasn't enough consideration of what the technology was to be used for. The requirement specification just wasn't really undertaken. It was all about function rather than, can somebody actually use this? So another robot that I've worked on in the past, the IRVIS prototype. So this is the Interactive Robotic Visual Inspection System. So what you've got here is a camera that's mounted above a tray of hybrid microcircuits. Now, hybrid microcircuits are the kind of circuits that you find in your back of your mobile telephone. So a typical such circuit would be, 4 or 5 centimeters square, that kind of size, often a lot smaller these days. And if you were to inspect them through the manufacturing process, what you had to do was pick them up, these very delicate circuits, put them under a binocular microscope and sit and twist and move the circuits with your fingers to then see is there a break in any of the copper? Is there a scratch on any of the surfaces? So the idea here was, what if you keep the circuits, which are quite delicate, in the tray and you move the camera over the circuit so you don't have to touch the circuit? Then the thought went, well, if all you do then is just have to look at them, you can get somebody who's in a wheelchair to do that job because they won't have to touch anything. They just have to control the robot, and the robot is quite robust. So they tried to put then an interface on this to control the robot. And the first interface, so this was Curl, which is the Cambridge University robotics language, looks like the picture that you see on the screen. And they took that to a user trial where they brought somebody in a wheelchair and said, you're going to do this task for a month. The guy came in, used it for an hour, and then signed himself off sick for the next 29.5 days. He detested it. So he absolutely did not want to do this. And you start taking a look at what's going on, you can see why, because the controls were controlling each of the motors individually. And so if you're trying to rotate about a point, so you've got a point in, you've got a camera pointing at it, and you're trying to move the camera around the point, the kinematics involved in actually making that movement are really, really complex. And this person was having to figure out each motor control. And this is a chap who's in a wheelchair to try and move the robot in that way. It was just hopeless. And then we got told, oh, the robot's massively under spec, it needs much bigger motors, it needs to be rebuilt, that'll be another £300,000, please. So what we did instead, I worked with a colleague whose background was fine art to develop a 3D simulation of the robot. So then we could figure out the kinematics of, if you take a look at the simulated camera on the robot arm, the green line there is a projection of what the camera can see. We then started to figure out what's the model of what motors need to move at what point in order to rotate about a point. So you can just keep looking at one part of the hybrid microcircuit and let the computer take care of all the advanced calculations. That's the kind of stuff computers are brilliant at, and the kind of repetitive motion that the robots do incredibly well. So we started changing the interface to that horrid one that we just saw, to one that included an overview of the robot, so you could see where you were, you could get a view of the camera, and you could start controlling the robot much more directly in words that were much closer to what you as a person were trying to do. And we continued to develop that further, so the buttons down the right hand side became much more natural. So you could translate, which is move side to side, you could rotate, which is obviously spin, you could tilt the camera angle on the gantry, or you could zoom in and out, and you could focus. And so the bit on the right hand side there is an actual genuine image that we captured from out of the robot camera, showing one of these microcircuits in detail. So the actual width there, is getting on for about a 40th of a millimeter. That's the kind of level of focus that we're at here, to give you an idea of how fine scale the movements needed to be to control the robot. So we took this one out, and we took it out to the Papworth Trust, which is a local residential community. It was originally designed for tuberculosis, but later became a long-term residence for people with profound disabilities and impairments. So you can see we've got this chap here using the robot. You can hopefully see the smile on his face. Now, this particular chap was deaf, he was non-speaking, he had athetoid cerebral palsy. So he was just about ambulant, or at least he was when I first met him. By the time that I'd finished working with him, he was in a wheelchair. That was nothing to do with me, by the way, just want to make that clear. It's just unfortunately the progression of the disease. But here he is, successfully able to use this robot to control these very fine scale movements and do it very smoothly and very accurately. So by focusing on making sure the robot did what it was supposed to in the easiest possible way, and it did all the boring, difficult mathematical bits, and it freed the person up to do what the person really needed to do, it worked well and we had success. And what's more, the cost of redeveloping the software was a fraction of the cost of redeveloping the robot, and redeveloping the robot would not have worked because the interface was still wrong. So if we move out of the workplace and into entertainment, most of you probably recognize the Sony Aibo. These were a limited edition robot that Sony developed back in the late 90s. They're incredibly rare and incredibly expensive now on eBay and things like that. So they originally costed the order of about £1,000 or $1,000. Very, very interesting robot. Sony just put it out there to see what the technology could do. But these things were very affecting, and people got very affectionate towards their little Sony Aibo dog. But the use of robots has gone from being cute and cuddly to something a little more vicious. And as we've mentioned earlier, that does include robots for kind of combat. So this was an early version of a robot that I was working on back in my Greenwich days. This was the early version of trolley rage. As you can see, the upturned shopping trolley. So we're trying to do something with, you know, find an interesting way of using shopping trolleys as they're getting to the end of their life. And ultimately that developed further into the robot that appeared on the television. Unfortunately, though, things didn't quite end as we might have liked. We ended up coming up against a robot called Carbide, which had a 25 kilogram tungsten carbide blade that span at about 2,500 RPM, that sliced through the front of the robot, you know, hot knife through butter. It really was quite devastating what that robot could do. But we learned from that and we've improved. So it came up with a better design that was more blade resistant, and that was the replacement. So rather than using mild steel, that one's got armored steel. Both Trolley Rage and this robot, which is called General Demeanor, we have now on the Bognor campus in the tech park. So if anybody ever comes on site and wants to see what the full-size robots look like, we do have them on the campus. But what we could do with that, though, what we did do is we ran a schools competition. So for about 4 years, we went out to local schools and invited the school kids to design robots. And then the winning schools were then supported in actually building the robots to come in and compete in the arena. And so the team on the left here was the team that won the first year that we ran the competition. The picture on the right shows some of these school robots. So these were weight limited. They had to be no more than about 6 kilograms. They had to be made out of wood, so then they weren't too dangerous. Even then, they could still take your ankles out really quite nastily. But what was absolutely great was, again, the response from the children. So we had teams competing from primary school all the way through to sixth form. And initially it was felt that all of the teams would be dominated by boys and dominated by teenagers. In practice, it was the primary school kids who were the most enthusiastic. And often the primary school teams were dominated by girls, not boys. It was only around the age of 12 or 13 that we started noticing a change in the gender of the teams. And some of that was actually down to the attitude of the schools themselves. So Kent has selective education and some of its grammars are single sex only. And some of the girls' schools positively refused to engage. And one of the quotes we had back from the headmistress was, "Our girls don't do that kind of thing," which was incredibly unhelpful, as you might imagine. But what was very interesting, certainly at the primary school age, you know, both genders were every bit as bloodthirsty. Both were wanting to see carnage and destruction and absolutely getting into it. In fact, the kids generally took one of two approaches. They either wanted to win or they wanted to see their robot obliterated. And the more destruction their robot took, the happier they were. Really quite an interesting phenomenon, but it did catch people at something of a visceral level. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, are these robots in practice.
Not back with Viva.
So that was the schools robots. That was in Maidstone. So that was after the schools event that we'd run. So these robots had already been through a number of heats and fights. And although it doesn't look like much at the distance at which that was being filmed, and what those robots were doing were punching quite large holes in each other. And there's a flipper on the floor. You can see there's a wedge-shaped robot in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. There's a flipper behind that, and some of the robots were landing on that and going 8-10 feet into the air, bouncing. And even though they're made of wood, they were still able to continue to drive and compete. So the schools not only were they happy to take part in the competition, they were happy to go along at these more commercial events at weekends and give up their time to show off what their children had produced. And this was a great success. Some of you might recognise there's a dark shape on the left-hand side of the screen here. That's the robot Matilda from Off the Robot Wars TV series. So it gives you an idea of scale of the school robots versus the heavyweight robots that you might normally expect to see. So we're taking that a little further at at Chichester, in that now we're aiming to get our first and second year engineering students to start building robots as well. But the technology's come on a bit from that video that we just saw, because that was about 6-7 years ago. So what I'm going to show you now is what modern featherweight robots are capable of. Now these are robots up to about 15 kilograms, so they're not the same scale as you'll see on the Robot Wars TV show, which are up to 110 kilograms, and that's what Trolley Rage and General Demeanor are. But this is what we'll be getting our first and second year students to do, and some of our partner colleges as well. So I'll get this to play. So to go back to where we started, of the notion of robots being scary, you wouldn't want to come across one of those outside of the arena. You can see the kind of power that's now possible in these things. But what we're trying to do is to teach the students the safety mechanisms that need to work around there. All those robots, while they are capable of inflicting an incredible amount of damage, have so many layers of safety built into them that the chances of them seriously hurting somebody, unless you are very stupid around them, are actually quite slim. And one of the things we did notice with the Robot Wars competition that we ran back in my Greenwich days was, while the health and safety teams were incredibly concerned around just how dangerous these things were, the children themselves recognised the danger of what they were doing, and they adjusted their behaviour accordingly. So they did recognise what was inherently potentially quite dangerous, and so they behaved so much more responsibly and so much more carefully around them. So while there is a lot of fear around what robots are capable of doing, in practice, if you design them correctly, you can mitigate for an awful lot of the danger. These are things that offer opportunities for us rather than something to be afraid of. So other applications that we're working on here at Chichester, we're looking at robots in horticulture. It's no longer acceptable to be paying people an absolute pittance to spend all day in a field and pick fruit when you can automate that. But the process of automating it is an interesting one, because you don't, soft fruit and things like that damage quite easily, so you need to be very careful how you grip. It goes back to one of the old challenges that's been around for robots for a while, especially in an area something like prostheses, which is, how can you design, say, a robot hand that can pick up a 1 kilogram bag of sugar, but can also pick up an egg without crushing it. It's a very similar type of challenge when you're looking at horticulture. You have to be able to pick up something sometimes quite heavy, but is also really quite delicate. We're also looking at areas of application in medical and health technology, especially around things like the eye, as well as general assistance, and trying to tackle the whole social care issue around how do you keep people in their home for as long as possible to reduce the need to go into homes. And that's better for the individuals, it's better for social care bills and so on. We're obviously looking at manufacturing technology. Any engineering school will look at manufacturing by default. But then we're also coupled with this the whole area of artificial intelligence, because again, a lot of the themes in science fiction around the blending of artificial intelligence with robots. I've done quite a lot of work in artificial intelligence, and the intelligence part of that is a big claim. These systems are inherently very dumb. And a large bit of the research in that space, the philosophical research in that space, is around how do you identify the limits of the intelligence, and how do you make sure that people don't trust the intelligence beyond what the intelligence is capable of delivering. So that's something of a galloped review of where I've engaged with robots, but happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Simeon. I think Paul's gonna.
Hi. We have Curtis. Do you have a question? Your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Simeon. That was a wonderful talk, and I have so many questions actually, but I'll just try and narrow it down to one. You were talking at the beginning about kind of Terminator and Skynet and this kind of fear of this kind of technological overtaking to Kazuo Ishiguro. I don't know if you've read his new novel, Claire and the Sun, too. We actually have the opposite problem, too. Like, instead of the Skynet takeover, the robots are too complacent, too, so they get taken advantage of by the humans in society, too. Is that another one of your concerns in your research, too? Or I was wondering if you had any comments on that book, if you've read it.
I haven't read the book, no. But I mean, I think it all comes down to what level of development the technology is at, as to what point do we start recognizing that as an entity with its own rights. As things stand, the technology is still very much at the stage of being a tool. I don't think any system, and bearing in mind, back in my IBM days, I helped work on the Watson system, which was the system that took part in the Jeopardy competition. While that was a very advanced, deep question and answer system and worked on natural language processing, nobody there would claim that it was capable of intelligent thought or anything like that. It was just a very advanced way of turning the numbers. It was Colossus on steroids, if you like. There was no, nobody would have thought twice about pulling the plug on it. Having said that, Robo-Thespian, so the robot that was on the news bit, because it was capable of tracking you, the programmers had been very clever in it, and that when you shut it down, as you left the room, it could track you as it left the room, and it would lower its head. And I remember the first time I saw this happening thinking, it's a robot. Why am I feeling sorry about leaving it? But this was entirely a programmed effect. The robot wasn't doing this through any form of intelligence or emotion. This was entirely an artificial artifact that had been put into it by the builders. It was very effective, though. And you did sit there and go, "Oh, should I be leaving it? It's a case of I've got to go home. I've got a son to feed." It's a robot. But you can see, obviously, at some point it will be eminently possible for people to start feeling a very, very strong attachment to the. I mean, people obviously feel quite attached to things like their cars and some of their computers already. But as you start getting more of the affective feedback, and another area of research I've been involved in the past has been around emotive computing and affective computing. So how do you get computers to better recognize human emotions? And that's been based on Ekman's facial action code. It's a whole field of that I could talk about for another hour. But as you start to combine that with artificial intelligence that's pseudo-human, or at least can resemble it enough to get people a little bit, you do start to end up with systems where you can imagine people forming very, very strong bonds with them. If they're at the point where the systems themselves start to have rights, so I think we're some way away from that. But you can get people who will feel that the system ought to have rights because of the strength of the emotional bond.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating.
That's Curtis. Lisa? Oh, sorry, I think Alison might have been next.
Alison was first and then Lisa. Thank you.
Hi, Simeon. That was very, very interesting. And I am definitely old enough to remember the Paranoid Android, not just the Radiohead album, and the Radiohead album, actually. That does age me quite a lot. I'm doing the awful thing of asking you a question related to my paper, which I haven't actually delivered yet. But one of the areas that I'm very interested in regarding robots, and particularly robots in domestic and service situations, is about the rights of the people whose jobs are being potentially replaced by robots, including people with learning disabilities themselves. So when we're talking about drudge work, we're very often talking about domestic work that low-skilled women and women in often extremely challenging circumstances can carry out. Do you, from your perspective, feel that this is inevitable, or is there a concern about it? That's sort of my vague comments.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, generally, it's always been one of those spheres with the advances of technology, hasn't it? As technology comes along, where is my job going? And the answer to that, obviously, and I would say this sitting in the university as I talk to you, is education. So how I view it as an engineer is the technology moves on. It takes away, as you say, a lot of the drudge work. What it does then is it frees us to think about the higher things that hopefully we as people tend to aspire to and find more interesting. So there's a lot of the same debate around artificial intelligence right now. So I was at a chat the other day with another group around the development of legal tech. So can you start getting artificial intelligence to start writing legal contracts, which then removes the need for paralegals who do a lot of that work? What are the paralegals going to do? There's a lot of debate around, what's going to happen. Now, my view on that is that if you take those kind of things away from people, how many hours in the day those kind of tasks take up, and as long as you are supported with appropriate education, it then frees you to do more of the artistic things, more of the creative things, the things that computers and artificial intelligence still struggle terrifically with. So hopefully, yes, obviously, the intervening period where work and income dries up is a challenge. Absolutely not overlooking that. But the idea then is that we're better able to do some of the higher things in life, if you like, because you're no longer spending 3/4 of your day doing the boring things to kind of keep yourself clean and fed and so on. So it's back to, I mean, how many people would go back to washing their laundry by hand versus using washing machines and so on?
Thank you. That's given me some food for thought.
No problem.
Lisa, your hand is up. And
yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I think I will take my lunch break to adapt my paper, because this is an excellent foil for what I'm going to talk about today. In your talk, in one of the video clips you showed us, you were talking about that technology is developed now to go back to those early ideas from like science fiction, I assume you were referencing. And since I'm kind of interested in the intersection between, science fiction and robotics research, could you like expand on that a little bit? Maybe is that a common thought? Or
well, yes, because engineers as a whole aren't very good at creativity. Engineers are generally very good at, we'll do the maths for you. We'll figure out, you tell us what you want. And so as a design engineer, a major bit of my work has been, how do you teach creativity to designers? How do you get designers to think about what could be, rather than simply an evolution of what is? Where can the technology be? So science fiction is an obvious place to go to, because a lot of engineers do read a lot of science fiction. It's somewhat stereotypical, but it's true. So science fiction becomes very easy to say, so, well, we want something that does as was in that novel or as was in that film. So it does become, and the sci-fi greats have often thought long and hard about this. So their ideas actually have a strong human heart behind it. So it becomes easy for somebody in my position to say, something like that. So that it's no coincidence that a lot of the modern robots, so the Robo-Thespian was intentionally designed to mimic a lot of the styling cues of the iMac type computer that was available at the time. And you'll notice looked very similar to Sonny, the robot from the I, Robot movie, the Will Smith one, which again probably looked nothing like Isaac Asimov originally envisaged. But it becomes helpful to have design cues of that kind, because also if we're trying to design things that people will respond to, if we can design something that the people themselves are already aware of through science fiction, usually. Now, tomorrow's world doesn't really exist anymore, and nobody really bought into the notion of tomorrow's world in any case. That was always fanciful technology that never really worked. But the sci-fi novels, you can see where the technology can go, and it becomes much easier to drive the technology towards something where somebody can see what the end product should do. So I think that the two fields are very strongly related.
Thank you so much.
On the schedule, it is time for the tea break now, and I'm really uptight about timings on schedules, Paul. So sorry. Oh, Paul, you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine, because we've rearranged things already. I mean, if there are hands up, so Simeon, are you around at lunchtime? Maybe people could contact you or email you with the questions, or send to you.
I'm probably not going to be around at lunchtime. I need to be.
Maybe we could say, if you want to ask questions now during the break, if you could.
Yeah.
Maybe and then if people want to move away and have a comfort break.
Yes.
At the centre.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to ask, I think Melina, you were next. So I'll be on mute.
Melina, you're on mute. Oh, can I unmute?
Sorry. Thank you so much, Professor Keates, for that brilliant talk. One of my observations was just a comment really about what you said about kind of the gender divide when teaching robotics in schools, because I can kind of totally agree that it could be about social conditioning altogether. And I have a short anecdote here. So I'm originally from India myself, and there was this time I was working in a village which was really remote, and half of the population in that district lives below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. And had so it was a non-profit organization which was running a school where I was working at, and we had a robotics workshop, and oddly enough, it was held for years 5 and 6, and oddly enough, most of the interested participants were girls rather than boys. Mm-hmm. It was really surprising, and you could see the boys yawning. So it was perhaps just a question of the individual being interested in robotics or not. They were not it was not like these were the smartest girls and these were the dumbest boys or anything like that. So yes, I do kind of think that it could have a lot to do with social conditioning. The other question, the other point that really intrigued me was what you said about sick people being more open to technological intervention.
Yes.
It surprised me a bit, because I would have thought that it means more loss of agency. But could you kind of elaborate on that perhaps?
Yeah. So if you start talking about something like the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things obviously is all these smart devices in your home, all communicating with each other and potentially communicating with external agencies. Most people take the view of, I don't want a camera in my phone a camera in my home monitoring me. I don't want my telephone listening in on everything that I do. So most people would say, no, I need to control my privacy settings. Somebody who's profoundly ill and maybe has got a history of heart attacks or something like that, usually understands that speed of response is a very key driver to survivability of a cardiac event. So they're usually quite happy to have all the monitoring technology monitoring them on the grounds that if that ambulance gets to them a minute and a half faster because the house went and summoned them rather than have somebody else come along and phone and dial, that minute and a half really matters to them. So they're often really quite happy to be monitored on the grounds that they know then they can continue to live in their own home and have a decent chance of survival because the house is monitoring them, or not so much the house as the technology in it. So they're prepared to trade privacy normally for safety and their own survivability. Whereas a lot of other people who don't feel that there's an imminent threat, the Grim Reaper coming along and to take them, generally take the view of the case of sod off, I don't want you monitoring me. So one of the worst examples I ever came across was I was at a talk at Georgia Tech, and they were monitoring people in a house. There was an old lady who was in a house, and they put a pressure sensor in the bed to try to determine what time she was getting up, what time. But the pressure sensor they found wasn't a simple binary one of on or off. It actually measured weight. And what they discovered was that twice a week, this woman weighed twice as much. And I was suddenly thinking, there's something wrong with our sensor. And that slowly occurred to them that kind of, oh, maybe they just learned more about this woman's social life than they were intending to find out. But it, she obviously wasn't too happy when she realized then that her privacy had been compromised. But it was one of those things, though, so she wasn't happy about it. But under different circumstances, might have been quite happy that, they were able to measure the data to that extent. So that's what I meant by healthcare status does impact, people's willingness to accept technology and above all to accept privacy breaches.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Naomi. Sorry, Naomi, you're on mute as well.
Oh, yeah. I'm clicking and then the little copy pop-up is coming up, so I can't tell what's going on with the mic. Anyway, here I am. Thank you so much, Simeon. That was a really fascinating insight into the work that you've been doing and are doing at the Tech Park. I guess my question follows on from the question about the effect on, on jobs, but also, we could look at that in terms of intimacy with sex robots. We can look at in terms of war. We had AC Grayling come speak to the university before some years before you arrived, and talking about very sinister aspects of artificial intelligence and off-the-loop systems of drones, weaponry that just you just program them to go and they go, and there's no actual human oversight. And the point he brought up was that there's absolutely no regulation on this on an international level. And so my question is really, to what extent is robot research developed in concert with other disciplines, in particular, I would say law, politics, sociology. I mean, obviously I'm in humanities, so I'm interested from the point of view of science fiction and creative writing. But I think in terms of where this is going, the ethics of it, I'm assuming obviously everything goes through ethics committees at a university, but beyond that, how many research projects, how much is it standard that we, that we get that input from other disciplines as projects go on?
Yeah, so some of my involvement with the IBM Watson system was around the level of ethics and also the implication of, as you start to develop better artificial intelligence, what does that mean for how people learn and how people control information, and how do you as a user of the system understand when the system has reached the limit of its knowledge and it's basically guessing, at which point its answers are pretty much worthless to you. A lot of university research obviously is highly regulated, and quite frankly, the budgets in universities aren't at the level to develop fully autonomous systems of the weapons kind of things. That sits very firmly in the arms industry, and obviously is outside the scope of what we in the universities would normally go anywhere near. A lot of the systems that we develop, so for example, the fighting robots that we saw have got many layers of safety built into them, and all of them ultimately have a kill switch that once you pull it out, the robot is dead no matter what. So there's a very physical override that pull that out, that robot, the battery is disconnected, the robot can't do anything. In practice, though, are some of those systems quite scary? They can be, yes, absolutely. Obviously, it would take somebody really quite crazy to develop a system that had no kill switch whatsoever. So the art then will be to find out what the kill switch is. Could somebody design a system like that? Absolutely, they could. And how do you stop them doing so? Well, you'd have to work on the assumption that it'd be treated the same way as indiscriminate landmines. This would basically be a killing machine that was let loose, and would have to be treated as some kind of war crime. But how exactly you litigate that when you're dealing with states, for example, that don't necessarily engage with the wider international community, it'll be very hard to outlaw. Ultimately, unless the robots themselves are incredibly hardened, a so-called EMP will take pretty much anything that's electrically based out. So there is ultimately a weapon that will disable pretty much all of these robots, which is the electromagnetic pulse weapon. these things are things that you don't normally use on a regular basis. They are quite powerful and they will cause a lot of destruction, but such systems can be taken out if they need to be, but not without its own cost. So there's no system that will truly take over. There will be a way of killing it. But ideally, you'd want them designed to a particular set of standards and ethics. Whether you can get all the countries to abide by that, that's a different question.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of how, it's interesting, what you say, the universities have their particular field, and then obviously when there's more commercial applications, then there's, businesses and corporations are doing that research. And maybe there's an area for universities to take a lead ethically, because ethics are so kind of inbuilt into what we do.
We could do with a code of practice for how to
and developing that in concert and putting that forward. It takes politicians to take it up as well, and to that level of external engagement.
To be honest, though, they can't even figure out what the rules are around autonomous vehicles. So self-driving cars, I mean, that's a legal minefield, and they just can't get that fixed yet either. So if they can't fix that, then fixing the ethics around weapons is going to be, Paul, I expect at the point to move on, don't you?
Sadly, have to bring that to a close. Fascinating it was. Simeon, that's a great start for today's event. I don't know if people want to clap or use a little thing, or if we're all out of practice of giving applause online. But we show our appreciation for Simeon for what's a really fascinating talk and a really great start to the day. I don't know if we want a couple of minutes, and we'll start at 1:15, and I'll shave a few minutes off my paper. We'll start at 1:15 then again, please, because we're not robots, so we need to go and get tea and go to the water closet and things like that, or go and cry about our robots in the corner. But if we can meet back in a couple of minutes' time.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Simeon.
Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.